August 30th, 1945. Atsugi Airfield, southwest of Tokyo. The first transport aircraft carrying American occupation troops descended through rain clouds. Japanese civilians lined the road from the airfield, silent, motionless, uncertain. They had been warned by their government to stay indoors, told that the Americans would be brutal, that women should evacuate or prepare to die defending their virtue. Instead, as jeeps rolled past carrying young men in clean uniforms, the Americans waved. Some threw chocolate bars to children standing at roadside. The children hesitated, looking to parents for permission, then rushed forward to grab the strange brown packages wrapped in paper printed with English words they could not read. The chocolate melted on tongues accustomed to nothing but rice gruel and foraged vegetables. The sweetness was overwhelming, almost painful. One child later recalled the moment as realizing that the enemy ate food that tasted like dreams. The contrast was absolute. Japanese civilians had endured 4 years of accelerating deprivation. Rations reduced monthly as the war consumed resources. Cities destroyed by firebombing. Families separated, children malnourished, adults surviving on fewer than 1,700 calories daily. They expected occupation to bring worse. Anticipated brutality as retaliation for Japanese military atrocities across Asia. Prepared for starvation under enemies who would surely take what little remained. What arrived instead was abundance beyond Japanese comprehension. American GIs eating fresh beef and white bread, driving vehicles that seemed brand new, wearing uniforms laundered daily, carrying equipment that spoke of industrial capacity operating without constraint. January 1945. Tokyo. Food rations had fallen to 280 grams of rice per person daily, supplemented with whatever could be foraged or grown in private gardens. Vegetables were scarce. Protein was memory. Cooking oil was unobtainable except on black markets where prices exceeded what ordinary families could afford. The government had implemented rationing in 1940, but by 1945 the system had collapsed under pressure of resource scarcity, transportation destruction, and administrative chaos. Urban residents received approximately 60% of their allocated rations. Rural families fared slightly better but still faced chronic hunger. The diet that had sustained Japanese civilians before the war, rice, fish, vegetables, occasional meat, had devolved to subsistence, levels that left millions malnourished and vulnerable to disease. The Japanese government had prepared civilians for privation through propaganda, emphasizing sacrifice for the emperor, glorifying hunger as patriotic duty. Newspapers published recipes for acorn flour, instructions for making edible paste from sawdust mixed with tiny amounts of wheat. School children were taught to forage for wild plants, to distinguish edible roots from poisonous varieties, to trap insects for protein. The rhetoric was martial. Hunger strengthened spirit, abundance weakened character. Americans were soft from overindulgence. Japanese would triumph through superior willpower, through acceptance of suffering that decadent democracies could never endure. The propaganda sustained morale through 1944, but by spring 1945, reality had overwhelmed ideology. People were starving regardless of spiritual strength. Children showed visible signs of malnutrition. Elderly died from diseases that well-nourished bodies could have. Resisted August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's radio broadcast announced surrender. In language so formal, most listeners barely comprehended the meaning. What they understood was that the war had ended, that American forces would occupy Japan, that everything they had sacrificed had been for nothing. Fear replaced exhaustion as the dominant emotion. The government immediately issued warnings. Women should avoid contact with occupation troops, should evacuate vulnerable areas, should be prepared to commit suicide rather than accept dishonor. Police in Kanagawa Prefecture recommended that young women leave the region entirely. Several prefectural authorities suggested that women should kill themselves if threatened with rape. The instructions reflected genuine belief that Americans would behave as Japanese forces had in China and the Philippines. That occupation meant systematic sexual violence and civilian brutality. The Recreation and Amusement Association was established by the Japanese government on August 18th, 3 days after surrender, to provide brothels for occupation forces. The reasoning was explicit: sacrifice some women to protect the majority. The RAA recruited women through promises of patriotic duty, through economic desperation, through outright deception. Facilities were established near expected American landing sites. The Japanese government believed they were preventing worse atrocities by channeling American sexual desires into controlled channels. The calculation revealed what Japanese leadership expected from occupation. Assumptions based on how Japanese forces had treated occupied populations, projection of Japanese military behavior onto enemies who might behave similarly. September 2, 1945. General Douglas MacArthur arrived in Tokyo. His first priority was not punishment or vengeance, but food distribution. MacArthur recognized that starving populations could not be democratized, that political reform required basic survival needs to be met, that occupation could not succeed if Japanese civilians died from malnutrition under American administration. He established emergency food relief through government aid and relief in occupied areas. Garioa funds that provided $92.6 million in fiscal year 1946, rising to $287 million in 1947, $351 million in 1948. The food was predominantly American agricultural surplus: wheat, rice, milk powder, canned goods. Distribution began within weeks of occupation, emergency shipments arriving before most Japanese civilians had direct contact with American troops. The food saved millions of lives. Japanese government statistics confirmed that without Garioa imports, widespread famine would have occurred in spring 1946. Food stocks in April had been nearly exhausted. Rations in Tokyo failed to deliver full allocations in 6 of 12 months that year. MacArthur ordered child feeding programs, school meal initiatives that reached 7 million malnourished children by 1951. The programs provided nutrition that Japanese families could not supply, prevented vitamin deficiency diseases, allowed children to attend school rather than spend days foraging for food. The initiative was pragmatic rather than altruistic. Healthy children would become democratic citizens, hungry children would become communists, but the effect was transformative. Japanese families whose children received school meals recognized that Americans were feeding them while their own government had failed to do so. The contrast became visible in every interaction between occupation, troops, and Japanese civilians. American GIs ate rations that provided 4,758 calories daily, more food than Japanese civilians had consumed even in peacetime prosperity. The rations included beef, pork, chicken, cheese, butter, fresh vegetables, fruit, chocolate, coffee, sugar. Soldiers received candy bars as standard equipment. Cigarettes were distributed freely. Alcohol was available through military exchanges. The abundance seemed wasteful to Japanese observers accustomed to consuming every grain of rice, to eating foods Americans would consider inedible, to treasuring items that GIs discarded without thought. The chocolate particularly symbolized American abundance. Hershey's had contracted with the War Department to produce chocolate bars specifically for military rations, producing 24 million units monthly at peak production. Each bar was designed to withstand tropical heat, to provide quick energy, to taste barely good enough that soldiers would eat them rather than saving them for later. To Japanese children whose only sweets were occasional rice cakes or watered-down sugar syrup, the chocolate tasted like luxury beyond imagination. American soldiers gave chocolate away casually, tossed bars to children from jeeps, distributed candy during patrols. The gesture was friendly but unconscious. Americans giving away surplus that meant survival to recipients. Cigarettes became currency in occupation Japan. American brands Lucky Strike, Camel, Chesterfield were worth more than Japanese yen on black markets. GIs purchased cigarettes at post exchanges for 10 to 15 cents per pack, sold them to black marketeers for 50 cents, who resold them for $1 or more. The markup was enormous, the demand insatiable. Japanese civilians would trade family heirlooms, kimonos, valuable possessions for American cigarettes. The tobacco represented access to pleasure that had disappeared from Japanese life. Small luxury that reminded people that existence could include enjoyment rather than mere survival. American soldiers made fortunes trading cigarettes, so much so that military authorities eventually instituted controls to limit the trade that was depleting Japanese resources while enriching both GIs and black marketeers. The jeeps represented technological abundance that Japanese civilians found incomprehensible. American forces brought vehicles that seemed fresh from factories, painted in colors that showed no wear, mechanical systems that functioned reliably without constant maintenance. Japanese vehicles in 1945 were barely operational, cobbled together from salvaged parts, running on ersatz fuel, breaking down constantly because replacement parts did not exist. The Jeep's design was elegant in its simplicity: four-wheel drive that engaged while moving, reliable engine that started in any weather, suspension that handled rough terrain without damage. Japanese engineers who examined captured Jeeps during the war had compiled reports acknowledging that American automotive technology exceeded Japanese capabilities by decades. Willys had produced 335,000 MB Jeeps. Ford had manufactured 280,000 GPW variants. The combined production exceeded all Japanese military vehicle manufacturing since 1935. The Jeep became symbol of American plenty. Vehicle so common that GIs drove casually, parked carelessly, maintained minimally because replacement vehicles were always available. Japanese civilians watched American soldiers driving through Tokyo as if vehicles were disposable, operating machinery that represented wealth beyond calculation to people whose entire economy had collapsed. The contrast was psychologically devastating to some Japanese men, particularly those who had believed propaganda about American industrial weakness. Seeing endless convoys of identical Jeeps, all new, all functioning perfectly, all driven by troops who seemed unconcerned about mechanical failure, because they knew another vehicle would replace any breakdown, forced recognition that Japanese understanding of American capacity had been catastrophically wrong. The uniforms told the same story. American soldiers wore clean fatigues laundered regularly, replaced frequently, tailored to fit properly. Their boots were new or well-maintained, their equipment was complete and functional. Japanese soldiers returning from overseas arrived in rags. Uniforms worn through years of use without replacement. Boots held together with wire and cloth wrapping. Equipment improvised from whatever materials were available. The visual contrast was stark. American troops looked prosperous, healthy, well-fed. Japanese veterans looked emaciated, exhausted, defeated not just militarily but nutritionally. The uniforms revealed which nation had industrial capacity to clothe its military properly. Which nation had fought at the end of strained logistics that could barely supply ammunition, much less replacement clothing. The food waste shocked Japanese observers most profoundly. American mess halls discarded food that Japanese families would have considered feast. Leftover beef, uneaten bread, coffee poured down drains, all waste that violated Japanese cultural emphasis on consuming everything, wasting nothing. Children watched GIs throw away half-eaten sandwiches, could not comprehend that anyone with food would discard it uneaten. Adults observed American garbage containing items that could feed families for days. The waste was not malicious, merely reflective of abundance so complete that conservation seemed unnecessary. Americans had never experienced starvation, had never lived with hunger as constant companion, could not understand that their casual disposal of food represented moral failure to people who had watched family members starve. The American military administration initially planned to maintain Japanese living standards at subsistence levels, operating under Directive JCS 1067 that specified occupation forces should take no steps toward economic rehabilitation. The policy lasted months before pragmatism overrode ideology. MacArthur recognized that starving populations threatened occupation objectives, that communist movements gained strength where people hungered, that democracy required citizens with sufficient nutrition to think about politics, rather than obsess about food. He pushed Washington for increased food aid, argued that preventing Japanese starvation was essential to American strategic interests, eventually secured funding that transformed occupation from punitive control to reconstruction assistance. The psychological impact on Japanese civilians was profound and contradictory. Gratitude mixed with humiliation, appreciation combined with resentment. Americans were feeding children Japanese government could not feed, providing medicine Japanese hospitals lacked, rebuilding infrastructure Japanese resources could not repair. The assistance was necessary and life-saving, but also reminder of defeat. Evidence that Japanese could not care for themselves. Proof that Americans possessed abundance beyond Japanese capacity to imagine, much less match. Some Japanese became grateful to the point of devotion, wrote letters to MacArthur praising his generosity, credited Americans with saving them from starvation. Others felt shame that required American charity, Anger at government that had promised victory and delivered catastrophe. Confusion about why enemies were more concerned with Japanese welfare than Japanese leadership had been. November 1945, Japanese civilians began to recognize that occupation would not bring the brutality they had feared. American soldiers were not raping systematically, not executing civilians randomly, not burning homes or confiscating all food. The Recreation and Amusement Association brothels, established to protect Japanese women from mass sexual violence, discovered that American demand was not as overwhelming as expected. MacArthur shut down the RAA in January 1946, declaring the system was debt-based sexual slavery and violated human rights. The closure surprised Japanese officials who had assumed Americans would want the service to continue. The assumption revealed what Japanese leadership believed about both American and Japanese behavior. Expectations rooted in how Japanese forces had treated conquered populations. Reports of rape by occupation troops did occur, but not at the scale Japanese propaganda had predicted. Documented incidents numbered in hundreds rather than tens of thousands. Criminal behavior by individuals rather than systematic military policy. American military police investigated rape allegations, court-martialed soldiers when evidence supported charges, imposed sentences that Japanese observers found surprisingly severe, given that victims were enemy nationals. The contrast with Japanese military behavior in occupied territories was obvious to anyone who examined the evidence. American occupation involved criminal acts by some soldiers, but institutional efforts to punish those acts. Japanese occupation of China and Southeast Asia had involved systematic sexual violence as military policy, with command structure organizing comfort station systems that enslaved tens of thousands of women. The abundance American troops enjoyed was not merely individual rations, but systemic industrial capacity. The food came from American agricultural surplus, production levels beyond Japanese farming capability to match. The vehicles came from assembly lines that had manufactured 650,000 Jeeps during the war. Industrial output that exceeded Japan's entire automotive production across all categories. The uniforms came from textile mills that had supplied American military with clothing, while maintaining civilian production at levels that left American families better dressed than in peacetime. Every aspect of American plenty visible in occupation forces represented industrial economy, operating at scales Japan had never achieved, even at peak wartime mobilization. Japanese engineers examining American equipment recognized the technological gap immediately. The Jeep's engine was simple but precisely manufactured, components machined to tolerances Japanese factories could not achieve with available tooling. The radio equipment American soldiers carried casually was more sophisticated than Japanese military command communications. The medical supplies American medics dispensed included antibiotics and sulfa drugs that Japanese military medicine lacked entirely. Penicillin, which American forces distributed freely to treat infections, was unavailable in Japan except through black market channels supplied by American theft from military pharmacies. Every piece of equipment revealed Japanese technological inferiority, proved that propaganda about American weakness had been lies, forced recognition that defeat was inevitable once American industrial capacity mobilized completely. The cigarette, that small paper tube filled with tobacco, became the recurring symbol of American abundance throughout occupation. GIs carried cigarettes constantly, lit them casually, offered them freely to Japanese civilians who treasured each one like currency. The cigarette represented multiple things simultaneously. American surplus so complete that tobacco was distributed as casual gift. Japanese desperation so profound that luxury items became more valuable than official currency. Connection between former enemies negotiated through small exchange of goods that Americans possessed in unlimited quantities and Japanese desired desperately. In the black markets that operated openly despite official prohibition, cigarettes facilitated every transaction, medium of exchange more trusted than yen, more liquid than gold, more universally accepted than American military script. January 1946. Garioa food aid reached full distribution. Japanese families began receiving wheat flour, rice, canned milk, goods stamped with American flags and English writing. The packaging itself told story of abundance, containers that protected contents, labels printed in color, quality control that ensured consistency. Japanese government rations had come in plain bags, irregular quality, sometimes spoiled because preservation methods were inadequate. American food arrived fresh, properly packaged, accompanied by instructions printed in Japanese explaining preparation methods. The contrast suggested industrial organization operating with efficiency. Japanese bureaucracy could not match. Agricultural system producing surplus while Japanese farming barely fed current population. The chocolate bar, the cigarette pack, the Jeep, all became monuments to American plenty in minds of Japanese civilians experiencing occupation. These were not symbols chosen consciously but objects that represented reality, forced into Japanese awareness daily. Children eating Hershey bars learned that Americans had so much chocolate, they gave it away to enemy children. Adults smoking American cigarettes understood that occupation troops had access to luxury goods Japanese could not produce. Families watching Jeep convoys recognized that Americans possessed vehicles in quantities that Japanese automotive industry could not approach. Each object was lesson in industrial capacity, evidence that propaganda about American weakness had been catastrophic lies, proof that Japanese leadership had led the nation into war against enemy, whose resources made victory impossible. The transformation of Japanese perception required years. Initial shock at American abundance gradually evolved into understanding that prosperity was not unique. American characteristic but result of industrial systems, agricultural methods, organizational efficiency that Japan could learn and eventually match. MacArthur's administration emphasized democratic reforms, but the deeper impact was economic education. Japanese civilians observed American logistics, studied how occupation forces supplied themselves, examined the systems that delivered food and equipment and medicine in quantities that seemed magical. The abundance was not magic but logistics, production capacity, transportation networks, organizational methods that coordinated complex operations across vast distances. The school feeding program, implemented in 1947, reached millions of Japanese children with meals providing nutrition their families could not supply. The food came from American surplus, but the program was administered by Japanese Education Ministry, staffed by Japanese teachers, implemented through Japanese organizational structures. The model taught Japanese administrators how Americans approached large-scale feeding programs, techniques for managing logistics at scale, methods for ensuring quality and consistency. The lessons extended beyond nutrition to systematic administration, to organization that could coordinate complex operations efficiently. Japanese bureaucrats observed American methods and adapted them to Japanese circumstances, learning through forced cooperation how prosperity required not just resources but systems to employ those resources efficiently. The black market in American goods persisted throughout occupation and beyond. Japanese civilians trading family possessions for American cigarettes, soldiers selling military supplies for yen. They used to purchase Japanese art and antiques, complex networks of middlemen facilitating transactions that were technically illegal, but practically tolerated because they provided Japanese access to goods they could not obtain through official channels. The market revealed economic desperation, proved that official rations remained insufficient, demonstrated that American surplus exceeded what occupation forces consumed, creating spillover that flowed into Japanese economy through semi-legal channels that authorities could not or would not completely suppress. The Jeep's legacy extended beyond occupation. Japanese automotive engineers studied captured examples, measured every component, analyzed design decisions, learned techniques that American manufacturers had developed. Toyota and Nissan and Mitsubishi would eventually produce vehicles incorporating lessons learned from examining American equipment. The Land Cruiser, introduced in 1951, reflected knowledge gained from studying Jeeps, understanding that four-wheel drive vehicles required reliability, simplicity, robust construction that would function in harsh conditions. Japanese engineers who had laughed at captured Jeeps during the war, who had dismissed American design as crude, discovered through detailed analysis that apparent simplicity reflected sophisticated engineering, that reliability required precision manufacturing, that American automotive technology exceeded Japanese capabilities by margins that would require decades to close. September 1952. The San Francisco Peace Treaty took effect, ending occupation. American forces remained in Japan under revised security arrangements, but formal occupation concluded after 6 years, 8 months. Japanese civilians reflected on the period with complex emotions. The occupation had brought food when starvation threatened, medicine when disease spread, reconstruction assistance when Japanese resources could not rebuild. But it had also demonstrated Japanese vulnerability, proved that survival required American charity, forced recognition that Japanese could not sustain themselves without external assistance. The humiliation of dependence mixed with gratitude for generosity, creating psychological tension that would influence Japanese-American relations for generations. The chocolate bar survived as memory in minds of Japanese children who had first tasted sweetness courtesy of American GIs, tossing candy from jeeps in 1945. Those children became adults who remembered occupation not primarily as military control, but as encountering abundance they had thought impossible, meeting enemies who fed them rather than starved them, discovering that Americans possessed plenty beyond Japanese comprehension. The memory influenced Japanese attitudes toward America, created foundation for alliance that would transform Japan from defeated enemy to valued partner. The alliance was built partly on strategic calculation, but also on recognition earned through chocolate bars and cigarettes and jeeps, through American willingness to feed starving former enemies, through abundance shared rather than hoarded. The cigarette, that recurring symbol of American plenty, continued circulating through Japanese black markets into the 1950s and beyond. American brands remained premium goods, cigarettes manufactured in United States commanding prices that Japanese domestic brands could not match. The market revealed that Japanese cigarettes were considered inferior, that consumers preferred American tobacco even decades after occupation ended. That association between American goods and quality had been established through occupation period experience. The preference was not merely taste but psychological. Cigarettes that reminded smokers of period when American abundance had seemed like fantasy, when occupation forces had possessed goods that Japanese could only acquire through black market channels trading family valuables. The Jeep evolved from symbol of American technological superiority to model that Japanese manufacturers studied and eventually equaled. By the 1970s, Japanese automotive industry produced vehicles that matched American quality, often exceeded American reliability, competed successfully in American markets. The transformation was deliberate. Engineers who had examined captured Jeeps in 1945 became industry leaders who emphasized quality control, precision manufacturing, systematic improvement. The Jeep had represented gap between Japanese and American capability, gap that seemed unbridgeable in 1945, but closed through decades of focused effort, industrial development, technological learning. The abundance American occupation forces enjoyed in 1945 was not sustainable luxury, but normal operation of industrial economy that had mobilized for war while maintaining civilian prosperity. Japanese civilians were shocked because their own experience was starvation and deprivation, because propaganda had told them Americans were weak and decadent, because reality contradicted everything they had been taught about their enemies. The shock forced recalibration of Japanese understanding of American power, recognition that industrial capacity determined war outcomes regardless of fighting spirit, acknowledgement that prosperity required systems rather than mere willpower. The lesson extended beyond military implications to economic development. Japanese civilians observed that American abundance came from agricultural surplus, from industrial production, from efficient logistics, from organizational systems that coordinated complex operations. The observation influenced post-war Japanese economic policy, shaped emphasis on industrial development, informed decisions about technology transfer and infrastructure investment. Japan would rebuild not by rejecting American methods but by learning from them, by studying how prosperity was created through systematic organization rather than resource extraction or conquest. The chocolate bar, the cigarette, the Jeep, all became evidence that abundance was achievable, that prosperity did not require empire or subjugation of other peoples, that industrial systems properly organized could create wealth that benefited entire populations, rather than just elites. The lesson was not taught consciously by Americans but learned through observation by Japanese civilians experiencing occupation. They watched American soldiers eating well, wearing clean uniforms, driving reliable vehicles, discarding goods that Japanese treasured, and concluded that American prosperity was not luck or propaganda, but result of industrial civilization, operating at higher level of organization and efficiency. The psychological transformation required years. Initial shock gave way to understanding. Humiliation evolved into determination. Dependence motivated eventual self-sufficiency. Japanese civilians who had been shocked by American abundance in 1945 became workers and managers and engineers who built post-war economic miracle by applying lessons learned during occupation. The abundance that had seemed impossible to match became standard, that Japanese industry eventually exceeded in some sectors, proving that prosperity was achievable through systematic effort. That occupation had been unintentional education in industrial organization that Japan would ultimately master. The cigarette continued appearing in Japanese memories as symbol of occupation period, small object that represented larger truths about American abundance and Japanese deprivation. Veterans recalled trading cigarettes for necessities. Civilians remembered receiving them as gifts from soldiers. Black marketeers documented fortunes made facilitating cigarette trade between American suppliers and Japanese consumers. The cigarette was physical object but also metaphor. Small luxury that revealed vast disparities in wealth and industrial capacity. Gift that created obligations. Commodity that facilitated exchanges between former enemies learning to coexist. August 2025. 80 years after occupation began. Japanese who had been children in 1945 remembered American soldiers giving them chocolate, offering cigarettes to their fathers, driving past in jeeps that seemed to emerge from another world. The memories remained vivid because the contrast had been so profound, because encountering American abundance had contradicted everything propaganda had taught, because discovering that enemies possessed plenty while Japanese starved had forced reconsideration of why the war had been lost. The chocolate bars and cigarettes and jeeps were not just memories but lessons in industrial power, evidence that prosperity required systematic organization, proof that American victory had been inevitable once industrial capacity mobilized completely. The shock Japanese civilians experienced when confronting American occupation force luxury was recognition that everything their government had told them was lies. Americans were not weak or decadent. They possessed industrial abundance beyond Japanese capacity to imagine. They fed their troops better than Japanese fed their own people. They threw away food that Japanese would have treasured. They gave chocolate to enemy children and cigarettes to former soldiers, and drove vehicles that symbolized technological superiority. The shock was not merely surprise but fundamental recalibration of worldview, forced acknowledgement that Japanese had fought war against enemy, whose resources made victory impossible, whose abundance revealed Japanese poverty, whose casual generosity demonstrated that prosperity came from industrial systems rather than martial spirit or territorial conquest.